Afternoon. Vamos a esperar unos momenticos para que entren más gente. We'll wait for another couple of minutes, or a few seconds, I suppose, for audience members to filter in. Pues hay más de 300 inscritos. There's more than 300 people who are registered. So it'll take a second or two. Va a durar unos segundos para que entren todos, porque hay más de 300 registrados. Y ya vienen. Bueno, voy a hablar en inglés por un minuto y luego voy a cambiar al español y vamos a presentar el webinar en español, pero con interpretación simultánea en inglés. Good afternoon, everybody. As people filter in, for those who would prefer to listen, the conversation will be in Spanish today, but we have crack interpreter Jaime Botero, who will be interpreting from Spanish to English. If you would like to listen to the interpretation, we invite you to hit the button at the bottom that says interpretation, and you should be able to hear that flawlessly. If there are any problems, please send us a note, and we will try to attend to your issues. Bueno, con eso vamos
With that, I will switch to Spanish. And thank you for being with us. We have people here from on our webinars from all the Americas, the Europe, government, private sector, NGOs, and several sectors of the economy and areas of life and walks of life. We are very proud of having I'm speaking to us about the elections in Peru, which are still going on. We have a great panel, top panel. And if you have a question, we will take questions in writing only. Just push the Q&A or question and answers. We'll try to ask the question, and we usually can't ask everybody or use all questions, but we will try. We have a lot of ground to cover today, and we'll try to include the question into the webinar. One logistics issue. Next week, we're going to have the 7th episode of the series about looking for the center, like political center in Colombia. The point of view of the state of Antioquia, a very important state or department in Colombia, and we will be publish the announcement tonight or tomorrow. And anything else that you are interested, you can check our website or associatecanada.com. With that, if I have covered the logistics, we'll start with the dialogue. Let me introduce the panel today. Now we have Denisse Rodriguez-Olivari, who is a politologist and a candidate for a PhD in Humboldt University in Berlin. Alberto Belaunde, a Congress member, president of the Special Committee about Climate Change. Tania, a former Congresswoman and now a member of the Continental League of Indigenous Women. And Dr. Fredy Vargas, recently Dr. Fredy Vargas, professor researcher from the Strategic Thought Center of the Externado University in Colombia. Well, with that, we'll start. And Fredy, I'll start with you. I want to talk a bit about the update of the votes. Where are we? And what are the figures, which seems to be interesting, urban and rural votes, and anything else that you would like to explain? Thank you, Ken. Thank you for your invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor to share this panel with such distinguished friends quickly, and so they can have time to talk about the main topic. Let's look at what we're at. Right now, what we have is we have 50.1 for Professor Castillo and 49.8 for Mrs. Fujimori. That's valid votes and percentage of valid votes. More or less, so that you can have an idea, we are going to have a universe of total votes, which is approximately 18 million. An interesting point that we can discuss later and look into more details, we're going to have approximately 1,200,000 blank and null votes, which is relatively low. We're going to have about 5.8 and 6% of blank and null votes and void votes. And another important thing that we have to look at here, in which is not minor for something that we'll be talking about, is that 18 of the regions, 18 of the population groups of the administrative division in Peru are with Professor Castillo, and 8 are with Mrs. Fujimori. Basically, in the case of Mrs. Fujimori, what she has as a popular force is the central coast of Peru and the north coast of Peru, including Lima, and Ucayali, which is a jungle department, which is almost tied with the rest of the country is with Peru. And an additional issue that we have to look at, and it's just to introduce the topic and then we'll discuss it further, is that the map as drawn in the map of Peru of the division between not right or left, but rather between the establishment and any alternative that is anti-establishment or any other choice is pretty similar to what we had in 2006 and 2011. We'll analyze that, the reason, what are the causes, and what could be behind that. What might happen with this percentage that remains, because we have more or less about 5% uncounted for. And that 5%, right now we have 2 things that are very powerful in this vote. One is a rural vote, which still we're waiting on it, and the foreign acts. The rural vote is expected to go for Peru Libre, and the foreign votes is expected to help Fuerza Popular. Which is going to be the biggest one? That's still right now. It's at 2 in the afternoon in Peru and Colombia. We're still in the same time. So far, we have approximately some 5 hours during which some 10 or 15 mathematical models running around, and none come to an agreement, whether it's going to be Professor Castillo or Mrs. Fujimori, the winner. Thank you, Fredy. Were you any surprises for you, or any unexpected results in the results, or is that according to like you anticipated? Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be sharing a panel with friends, and these we have always surprises in Peru. And I think that there's never a boring moment in Peruvian politics. I was expecting a movie ending according to the projections, but what I think that's happened is that a lot of people tend to make this beliefs. Well, there's a very funny phenomenon that took place in the social networks, was the presence of older adults, pretty older, coming to the voting places that were supposedly helping Mr. Fujimori. And says, no, the older adults, the absenteeism hasn't been that big, especially where people don't go. The same range of absenteeism. We thought that we're going to be voting for Fujimori, but that was not really true. did surprise me is the composition of the Peruvians voting overseas. The Peruvian vote overseas, it was or is um, economic migrants or who left Peru in the 90s and usually vote more to the right, conservative, or for Yumori. So there was that sort of expectation that the voted overseas would take the candidate, the Fujimori candidacy, but not as overwhelming as it was expected. Pedro Castillo is going to have Cuba and Russia. Well, not surprising. Apparently, in Italy, where there's a good number of Peruvians living, we have the Peruvians have been everywhere in Macedonia, Northern Macedonia, in New Zealand, for example. We're still continuing to wait for the acts, but there's an expectation about that because some consulates have wanted to scan the acts, but others have decided not to send more information until they send the physical documents, and that's creating a little doubt and hesitancy in the social networks. We'll have to be very calm and very prudent over the results. This is going to be very close. There's no way to predict what most serious people tell us. They have some analysis. They haven't decided not to make any major projections because this is very close. The rural vote seems to support Pedro Castillo, and overseas seem to go for Mrs. Fujimori, but the percentages are very difficult to tell. But in both candidacies is that the elections have been democratically carried out, no problems. We have installed all the voting booths, and no candidacy should foster violence or doubts. This is what I really expect because if we fight vote by vote on the tables, we have some may fall into undemocratic behaviors. Speaking about urban rural, Tania, in the previous elections, Fujimori's party had a lot of support in the rural areas, if I'm not mistaken. This time it's not as much. And I assume that the fact that Castillo is strong in the rural areas is part of the explanation. But Tania, do you think that there are other factors that have caused or have cast their vote for Castillo and not in Ms. Fujimori? Good afternoon, Ken. It's very pleasant to be able to have a diverse reading of this electoral contest of the second round. And I thank you for this time because it's important to have an indigenous perspective, because the rural area always includes indigenous citizens. And the profile of Pedro Castillo is a reflection of most Peruvians who come from rural areas, from the provinces, not high economic status, but citizens who make a living working, many of them in informal jobs. They care for their families with very low paying jobs. And the teachers, for example, I mean, the unions, the professors of educators who for many years and decades, until the present, really were not valued, were not recognized in their job. And that profile that Pedro Castillo is showing or reflecting is what most can see from their own realities. So the results that could say that Castillo is a winner, it's a rejection of the continuation of the same old with the same policies or politics. And that's gone overboard of the institutional part of the Peruvian state. But the political class or technocrats that have been for more than 10, 20 years in ministries and haven't been able to solve the major structural problems. So when we the citizens of the popular class, the people, we see that they're the same ones we had on a chance and they've had a change in the situations that we can see in our job, well-being, health, housing, etc., and basic rights. We believe that there's a chance for a real change and hope. But I also think that there are other factors that have to do with racism and discrimination. These elections have reflected a level of racism and discrimination against the provincials, those who don't speak well, those who are supposedly do not know anything about the problems or the proposals for change in the country. And that's what is it, I would say, just to strengthening that resistance and that identity that many of us have been denied because we've had rulers who have exercised a very relationship of power based on discrimination and racism. So a candidate like Pedro Castillo gives us a different view of this diversity. And the other thing that has also shown this vote is a critical opinion by the citizens is that strategy. In regions like where I come from, Ayacucho, Huancavelica, hard hit by the violence of the 80s, those are the ones that today, more than 80, up to 90% of the votes have been given to Pedro Castillo. So selecting a federal structure, when you see that there's some active citizenship, you can't use a terminology to qualify irresponsibly our citizens. Mrs. Fujimori's strategy has been counterproductive because we have more critical generations who are studied, who have been able to have an analysis. So they have a new birth of the citizens. And this has been reflected by the massive marches started and driven by the youth. And after the Congress, they threw like a coup, wanted to put Mr. Merino as a president, but there have been some conditions that have led to the people to have a position and not to continue with the same old. That's also arguable because we're still doing the counting, and we don't know who will win. There's a margin, not as high, but it might be Mr. Castillo. But I wanted to say what I just mentioned because I feel that I feel that as a citizen that comes from this popular sector that are tired of this traditional politicians. We need new faces, new leaders, and a new, more human. This is a common sense of solidarity, of not falling for strategies which is conditioning the elderly to go and vote. No, this has to have some reaction from the people. Thank you, Tania. Alberto, given what Tania says, in global terms, the results, although it shouldn't be that unexpected, perhaps it is unexpected. But if it weren't Castillo, and given the circumstances, Tania said that it was going to be Castillo or some other man or woman, or today or tomorrow, to lead this and dissatisfaction with the system. You come from the center right, center. I don't know how you want to rate yourself, but don't come from the rural areas. So how do you react what Tania has said and anything else that you have might have suspected? thank you for the invitation. And here my friend Tania, but my friend and colleague who have been in Congress together, and we participate in several common struggles. It's always a pleasure to be with her. And Denisse says something that is very relevant. I'll give you a minute, and then I won't duck your question. It's about the electoral system, and specifically about the OMPE, which is the electoral institution in charge of this process. Today, we are about to have results almost 100% of the results. It's unheard of in the Peruvian history. Since 2001 until now, we hadn't had a series of officials information very incomplete. And as the days went by, we were clarifying the figures. But the fact that the OMPE is providing such fast results that have been able to organize the electoral process in the midst of a pandemic. The first round was in the midst of the second wave of COVID. The fact that there isn't major real questions about their job is not minor in a state like Peru, which is always trying to strengthen their institutions. We had 100% of the voting booths open. Everyone who has come to the place to vote all over the place, rural, urban areas, have been able to vote. And something that is important to point out is that the current head of the OMPE, who has done a career in this institution, was elected by a public contest by the National Justice Board, which is the institution that we created in the past Congress and which was supported by the citizens in a referendum that replaced the National Council of the Magistrates, which was absolutely corrupt. And it was the center of the scandal of corruption that came up as the white collar or the Hermanitos scandal. With this electoral process, which is flawless, not only a model for Peru, but for the entire region, we are seeing the results of this citizens' indignation of 2018 and the citizens' participation in that referendum. And it's not minor because we haven't stopped to, as the citizens, because in the midst of this, it's a little difficult to stop and think. But I think it's worth mentioning because we have done something right, and I think that should be pointed out. Paradoxically, this is the most confrontational elections. So already the last couple of weeks, we've had a couple of fake news campaigns involving the elections, driven mostly from the ultra-right, but also some from the extreme left, but mostly the ultra-right in Peru, trying to create the questioning the results. So we have to look at what is going to happen in the next couple of days and the next couple of hours, because it is a sector of the population which is not willing to take any result as it should be in the democracy. So I leave you. That's a positive, but also this concern as well that I think is important to consider. The appearance of Castillo, who is a sudden appearance in the campaign, has more to do than with the identity issues and the fact that that is not part of the traditional politics, more than as a result of ideology. There's a measure that could be, it could explain some of the drive he had. He had an ideological basis, but it's more like what Tania said. It's an issue of becoming identified with him and finding a way to protest vis-a-vis a political class that they believe is uncaring. And it's showed its all its limitations during the pandemics. If you look at the surveys over the past year, what you can see is an elector, a voter that is looking for that candidate to represent this breaking point as from the politics as it has been going on. It could have been like a former soccer goalie where that then he went to somebody who was been in the Congress for a long time, has a public image of a populist. That also came down. And over the last week is when we have had Mr. Castillo. Let's remember also that both Mr. Castillo and Mrs. Fujimori have come to the second round with a percentage vote which might not have allowed them to be in the second round during the previous elections. But the level of fragmentation has been such in our country that with a lower percentage, both of them were able to come to the second round. And in the second round, for example, those who feel more identified with the political center, we were forced to decide probably for the one that gives you less rejection. So it's interesting to analyze the Castillo phenomenon and also the Fujimori phenomenon, who's had been in jail. They faces the face of the previous Congress, very low prestige, and she's still a few thousand votes from being president of the country. So I think that both phenomena are interesting, but tell you about an absolutely polarized scenario and that shares some characteristics, not all, with what has been happening in the Latin American regions about the relationship between the citizens and the state. But in general, the citizens vis-a-vis the democracy in the sense of representation, and we have lost in many cases. I want to go back to a couple of topics. You speak about fragmentation. Well, we know that fragmentation does not necessarily mean polarization. There is polarization. And that's, for example, there's a big dialogue in Colombia. There's some analysts who want to bury the political center in Peru because they know it's the second round. They had people, I don't want to use the word extreme, but there were pretty different polls. But that means, Denisse, that there isn't really a center, or there hasn't been a candidate, an outstanding candidate for this center. For example, Mr. Saulo del Solar, might he have won? So they would have spoken about the great political center in Peru. So the question is, does that mean that the political center in Peru disappeared, or are they just simply circumstances and how the political system works? I think that looking at the results from the Congress, I think that Peru is pretty more conservative than we would like to accept. We have some leftist, conservative candidates. We have an extreme right party, a large number of congressmen. I think that this is going to mean a return to all the LGBT focused on gender. Let's talk about the environment. I think that we're going to have a, the academy or the committee activism. We have to try to push for that, because in the Congress, we don't have much representation in that area. Yeah, along those lines, we have a candidate that represented the Republican Center only have about 2%. So how do we build these electoral alliances vis-a-vis 2026? Because by themselves, they won't be able to get to a double-digit percentage. So this is something that we still have to do. How we look at the country and what is our position. For example, religious conservative views have a lot of impact on the large population, number of the inhabitants, Catholics or evangelists. So the conservatism has come out, and we see how that the appeals to country order, the traditional family are pretty popular, in spite of what we would like, in spite of those who really are more progressive, most progressive. What do you think about that, Fredy? Is there a center, a robust center in Peru? Or are they just needing a political vehicle to express themselves? Or are we talking about another phenomenon? There's a couple of things here about what Denisse said. Well, what we say is that Congress is going to be the most conservative over the last 30 years, now that it's coming up. But I'd like to separate the aspect how we are establishing the population. Approximately 4 years ago, we had a very interesting study, 15+1 in Peru, about how our political spectrum was made up and what they showed. And it's very interesting to be able to do it for the rest of America. What it shows is that most people, most of the population, identify themselves with ideas and values of the center, a little bit, slightly to the right, but just that but a pretty strong concentration. And when we tried to do that last year, that was done in 2020, is that it had actually moved a few more degrees to the right. That is, the average in the mode, the mean in the mode had moved to the right, but also there's a big group in the center, which is very important. What has grown vis-a-vis the analysis of 2020 is the extreme, the tail that goes to the right, the extreme right. That did grow as a percentage, as a representation of the population, without being a majority or anything like that, but it has increased in the representation. Now, there are two things that I didn't want to forget about what Denisse was saying. As you know, Ken, we were doing a 3-year study at Externado, Colombia, about the causes and how the Peruvian political system operates in the long term. And there are two things that might be related to what we were told by Denisse. The first thing is why people don't vote for the center. And when we look at the composition of the value system and culture in Peru, we see that there's an element which is outside of the values and anti-values, but which is one side. It's always there. It's a fear. Just it. In this campaign, we see a lot of that. Why do you vote? Because of fear, or fear of what you have in front of you. And actually, that is not a good reason to vote. And something else in this analysis is the need to create new leadership. But people, what people want, what people ask for in this study that we saw, is that they're asking for leaders that are strategists, that they are well prepared, that they have a certain experience, not in politics, but in any field, but they can contribute new ideas. And the fourth is that they understand the context not only of their environment, but also the context in general. And the four are in trouble right now. We have a problem. Thank you, Fredy. And Tania, you've spoken about Congress, so you know how Congress works. I'm not going to go into that question for you, but the two candidates have profound purposes, things that could change the system up to point. And we've said that the Congress is more conservative than ever, and Castillo comes out ahead. How is he going to handle that relationship with the Congress? Is the Congress going to be an obstacle for him, or how can he manage this relationship? Tania, please. Let me. About this polarization that you say that we have in our country, and there is a center that is disappearing. I think that from the first round, the political center started to disappear because of the campaign itself. Helped to polarize by the press to help to polarize it. The discourses, the messages, and the position of the media in Peru have been biased, and in this case, towards Mrs. Fujimori. That's so obvious, and denying that is to deceive ourselves, because most of the press in Peru, the press in Peru, has become biased and has had a not indirect, it's a clear, open support for Mrs. Fujimori, and causing the polarization and creating fear and even panic in some areas. And they had central candidates in the first round, but they became diluted. We checked that with the results with the votes during the first round, and nobody expected them, Mr. Castillo, to lead the votes. He was not even in the map. The press hadn't even thought about him, but Mr. Pedro Castillo was going around the entire country and getting close to the people and show himself to be a new political leader, but also with a recent history of leading the defense of education, the rights of the teachers, the great march of these teachers, were more than 60,000 teachers in Peru, in Lima, and then even more in Peru. So the role of Congress is going to start to change, depends on the winner. If it's Mrs. Fujimori, is going to consolidate and relationship between the executive and the legislative, and there's going to be a great block in favor of Mrs. Fujimori. It could be approximately 80 that are going to go to support what her bench and what she wants to do with the legislature. The role is going to be different if Pedro Castillo wins. I think that we're going to something like what went on in the past Congress, because Fujimori isn't going to let go of their piece of power in the legislative. They're trying to debilitate the bench of the Peru Libre, which is not really a minority. Never 37 congressmen. So we're going to have to, anyway, this confrontation and correlation of political forces that they are not going to be reaching consensus unanimously. There's not going to be a fabulous relationship between the executive and the legislative. I think that the legislative has some popular power, and if it's only 5 or 10, they have a lot to do. And the attitude of the people, this popular support, is key for when Mr. Castillo becomes president, because he has flown that flag that with the support of the people, we will win. So people also have that that vision that it's possible to support a series of demands and bets. With respect to the conservative about the uh, priority agendas such as gender diversity and other priorities, at least in the band that is going to be set up by Peru Libre, I've been able to hear them, especially the women. They don't have a contrary position against gender photos. They have made it public in the media, but we know the position which is completely against and no steps ahead is those who have a right position, alt-right, like Fujimorism, because they do have as allies mis hijos no te metas, the religious groups, the evangelicals or the evangelists. We had congresses who raised the Bible to heighten their religion, and they wanted to have a Bible day in Congress. We know that that position isn't going to change for Mr. Fujimori, because they want to reaffirm that their supporting group is that they're conservatives. In the case of Pedro Castillo in Peru Libre, there's a chance even to use the support given by the people to set the agenda and the position of the social movements, women, the feminists, even the indigenous peoples have presenting some agendas. For example, the Amazon people have made an agreement with Mr. Castillo to tell them that their priorities for the peoples in the Amazon was everything has to do with legal security in the territory, supervision of the oil wells which have spills, and they are blamed for promoting these spills by the who are directing and managing these companies. So I do think that this is also going to require organized society, the collectives that bring issues like the gender focus. Myself, one of them. We have hard work ahead of us. It's not going to be easy. That will make us be better citizens. We don't just want to be governed. We want to interact and also be part of the governance of our country, and to show that these changes are possible amidst all this adversity even. Thank you, Tania. Alberto, you're so lucky because you are an influential congressman. You're going to be in the midst of that mess, and in the relationship of the Congress with the executive. How do you see that? One of the possible dynamics and in the future of that relationship, is that going to be a stagnant situation, or is there a way to move ahead with these issues for Peru, or how do you see that? I finished my mandate here in June. The new Congress, I will be out. I will not be responsible for that. Thank God, you can say exactly what you want, you know. I'm a little less optimistic than Tania. I think that in both political groups, there is no necessarily the democratic conviction that there should be for the task that we have in the country. Peru Libre and Fuerza Popular, because of the declarations from the PE leaders, the documents, they have positions that are very worrisome. belittlement of the inter-American system, Nipalai, which is one of the most the appellate in a xenophobic discourse in a country that is receiving a lot of sisters and brothers from Venezuela in this humanitarian crisis that involves the entire region. This appealing to this xenophobic discourse speaks badly about these things. Mrs. Fujimori has moderated that during his campaign, but in the previous Congress, where Tania will not be letting me lie, after the last day, until it was dissolved, we had a congresswoman asking for the expulsion of all our Venezuelans from the country. And Foresight, Mr. Castillo, both in the debate and in his last speech before elections and throughout the campaign, has had different expressions about xenophobic statements that completely unacceptable. I don't know how disciplined or consolidated these parliamentary blocs are going to be, and that's going to be interesting to see. And I agree with Tania when she says that, of course, we have to see what bloc is going to be the official bloc, because that might change a lot the relationships of power in Congress. If it's Keiko Fujimori, the rightist sector, what they're going to do is to support her the governance of Mr. Fujimori's. But it's not Fujimori. I don't know how much they're going to be working as a bloc, or whether they want to be able to separate and work independently. In Peru, not all of them are militants. They're not members of the party. One of them might be officials, which more easily to have a cohesion. Another thing is for them to be the opposition groups. Those oppositions become fragmented over time. There's a major question mark here in this Congress, but in general, the political design, this willpower is not of consensus. It's more of concentration within this concentration policy. And usually the strategy that used to be followed in the Peruvian politics was first round, you kept to your ideological spectrum. And in the second round, what you did was made all your effort to capture the center. And the one who got the most believable position for that candidate was the winner. I haven't felt that real effort to moderate, wanted to appeal to a different voter, a different political center voter. I think that both candidacies have appealed more to rejecting their contenders than to proposing a more moderate view of themselves. Perhaps it has something to do with the fact that one of the reasons for this lack of prestige of the political class in Peru is this idea that, of course, you're one thing in campaign, and after you're elected, you're somebody else. And that says, well, I voted for I was in the campaign, not for the one who's in power right now. So try to get, to avoid people from, getting some support. For example, in this Mr. Castillo, is that he hasn't fallen into the temptation of moderating his discourse or appealing to a very different public from what he was saying sympathetically. Denisse and Fredy, who wants to? Is there a room for consensus? Are there any indications that both candidates can be govern more in the center or less to the extreme? Is there a possibility of that? I am somewhat pessimistic in that. My professional training But something to take into account. Pedro Castillo is, I don't know the latest results. Perhaps he might take his electoral zones without having made major changes or moderating his discourse. And the candidacies, certain degrees of variation. We wanted to activate the Constitutional Tribunal. We're not going to affect the Inter-American Rights, Human Rights Court. Well, but Pedro Castillo has moderated himself towards the end, but he hasn't made any changes. Not because he's Pedro Castillo, because he is not Fujimori, where he had his main political capital, although he appealed to appear like the people who are the invisible ones are really the invincible ones. He speaks about his experience as an educator in public schools. He had to walk several hours to get to the school. So they see somebody who can really respect their own interest, and those who he has a very good group. It was the option that was left for Mrs. Fujimori. There was a non-partisan force in Peru, composed by different age groups. They were not cohesive, but a major movement. And the last movements have been able to adhere to any candidacy that was not Fujimori. And his candidacy has helped that group. And he must recognize certain of the demands from that group because they have adhered to his candidacy in spite of the fact that he's made some claims that he might have said during the campaign. So they will have some debts to pay to that group. But you're a pessimist, but not an extremist pessimist. I'm a central pessimist. I agree with Denisse. I just wanted to add a couple of things to in general, the reading is that if some of the two, both Mrs. Fujimori and Castillo, when they went, they have the support of the entire population and they can do what they feel like it. They're nuts. That won't happen. That's one thing. There are two very serious studies in IAP and Apoyo for several weeks ago where they study a bit the issue of change. And when you look at the change and you ask people, do we need to make any changes? Really, in something of our, let's not say an economic model, but it's a development model, we call it. And most people say yes. Even the urban sector, the places, how much is that moderation? How much is the level of change and transformation that we need? That's where the problem is. And that's exactly the point where we have to, Mrs. Fujimori has to do, or Mr. Castillo has to look at how much will they able to do in these changes. The major question is, we have to ask ourselves, Mrs. Fujimori, will she want to make any changes? And the second is, on the other hand, is Mr. Castillo. Will he make moderate changes and that demolish the entire system? That is the issue. How can you balance this thing in the middle that really responds to the people? I was talking to some friends a couple of years ago, politologists, and he said, the major problem we have are political classes that they have a major problem of active listening. It's not simply listening, it's listening, reasoning, weight cognition, and finding some responses, but also being empathetic, understanding what people want, what people are talking to. We don't understand when we don't getting it, and when we don't understand it, we get into the big trouble we get into. We have to have changes, obviously, but we don't have that change of I don't do anything or everything. No, not neither of the two. The point has to be discussed, has to be to the middle. And like Lisa says, it isn't going to be easy. This isn't going to be easy, but we need to put in another thing in the middle, which nobody is talking about it. And it's embarrassing not to listen to it. Nobody's looking strategically for the medium and long term to things. So everything is thinking tomorrow and what are we going to do, but nobody's thinking about what are going to be having 5 years from now, 10 years from now. What are we building, or what are we not building? That multi-temporal perspective we don't have. One of the most arguable proposal of Mr. Castillo, and I've received several questions about that, is this about how to convene a constituent assembly. Do you think it's if Mr. Castillo wins, will he continue with the proposal and is going to force the proposal of calling for a constituent assembly, or that could that be some not for the immediate attention? It's not one of his priorities. What do you think, Tania? One of the proposals that he made is that the change of the constitution, and I think that a lot of Peruvians went forward for Mr. Castillo because that's something a felt need vis-a-vis a neoliberal regime that is reflecting inequality and exclusions that have been reflected also more noticeably in this pandemic. So I do think that in the short term, as he said in his discourse, 6 months will call for an assembly. My personal opinion is that Mr. Castillo should go for a formal way to change the constitution. That is, have a constitutional assembly, but respecting the formal procedures as done in the parliament, that you have to add an article in the current constitution that will enable the constitution to be changed to respect that democratic space, get a consensus about that, and that the social organizational forces can also have representation. We as original peoples are interested in, for example, our political representation, legal representation is set forth as a political right in the Constitution. Then you can speak about a basic law, organic law, or part of the electoral law, or whatever, indigenous campaigns, but recognizing the political, economic, social, and cultural rights of the indigenous peoples. It is mandatory in a constitution which does not represent us in our constitution. We are not even mentioning that in our constitution. In the past Congress, there was a proposal of constitutional reform that we proposed, and Fujimori tabled it. So I think that there's a need to create the democratic conditions that are transparent participation. So it's worth reviewing a change in the contents of the Constitution, but it should be done with the conditions of whatever time it takes, and not to disrespect the constitutional and legal procedures according to the current Constitution. I think that he can call. We can on many more sectors that might not feel represented right now in this current constitution. So there's a possibility to do those changes. We did that in our office in the previous Congress. What would be the articles, the basic articles to to start writing up, redoing. And there's some very basic rights: education, health, recognition of original languages, collective ownership of the land, the restitution of the unalienability. The land cannot be seized. The Constitution of 1979 recognized it. In 1993, eliminated that right. Articles like those are basic for a country that is has a large, big problems created by their own normative frameworks, or because the national laws are not harmonized with international treaties. I think that this is an interesting context for social movements, like the indigenous peoples can have a more visible role. In living example is Chile. We know that the Mapuches and other peoples who are in our neighbor country were discriminated and were victimized. There were no indigenous for this. Chileans have shown that there is possible to have different areas to work for. In new constitution, 17 positions by 9 women who are in those seats in Congress, and they can write up a new constitution. In a country where we had look, and the neoliberalism worked well, we have the same response like we used to have. So we are appealing here from our organizational trajectories in our demands. We do need a new Magna Charter. This is the end of the time, but if anyone wants to speak another minute, please. Alberto would like to go. Thank you. I think that these next few days, we'll see how mature our political system, parties are, even in public opinion sectors. The democratic maturity, the results are very close. And when there's such a very close results, it's easier to sell a specific narrative that might not be supported by evidence, but which are functional for certain political interests. So we have to be very, very attentive, very critical to denounce any attempt of disrespect against the popular will. In Peru, we've had clean elections, free elections, serious and independent institutions. And on Sunday, Peruvian men and women were able to express their vote, and there's no arguing about that. And that is something that should be a reason for consensus, like in any democracy. So I'd ask both for those who are in the country and those who are following our political processes to be very, very attentive to any attempt to destabilize, which endangers these assumptions. Thank you for the invitation. Fredy and Denisse. Quickly, from the article that Alberto wrote yesterday in Peru 21, the country will not sink or say, due to the election by itself. What we have to find out is what's behind this, what makes us Peruvians, what can help, what can tighten our social fabric, how can we really build a country where everyone has a chance, and let's kill ourselves over ideas that we can build based on dialogue. We can create some dialogues, some changes, and I would think that civil society is going to have a very large weight, not only in these next few days. of the elections, which will be 4 or 5 days while we close all the events, but rather here in the future, at least for the first year or the first couple of years of the administration is going to be, you have to have an active surveillance about our society. And we're going to see what we're going to do and how can we build based on that, but always based on analytical criteria. Thank you. Thank you, Fredy, Denisse. I'd like to say thank you, Ken, for your invitation and the panel members for this interesting talk. How did we come to this reflection, up to this point? What is going to happen tomorrow and next few years? How did we come to this position? How do we have these problems in the country? How can we have a capital that votes such differently from the rest of the regions? What tells us that the 20th poorest countries, district in Peru, vote for our Castillo? So this is no longer of how well the model works, how much money there is. It's all the social demands have been ignored for a long time. We have to have we've had always in peace the same electoral behavior from one wing or the other, one Castillo. So we have to work also together and understand all the demands and the needs for the entire country. Thank you, Denisse. Thank you, Alberto, Tania. Once again, as I said at the beginning, it's a luxury panel, and we're going to be following very closely what's going on in Peru, and we are going to call for another webinar very soon with you, see how the facts are going, and then another electoral process. We'll talk again. The recording for this panel is going to be on our website either tonight or tomorrow, the latest, cccanada.com. With all of this, I want to thank once again Alberto for our interpreter, and as always, our Vice President, who organized all of this event. With that, I say goodbye and thank you once again. Have a good evening, good afternoon at least. Thank you very much. Thank you.